The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Patterson and Associates on the 42nd floor. Each drop a tiny percussion marking the end of something that should have mattered more than it did. Grayson Blackwell uncapped his Mont Blanc with a soft click that seemed to echo in the mahogany-paneled conference room, the sound swallowed immediately by the storm outside. His signature swept across the divorce decree with practiced ease, the kind of flourish he used on acquisition contracts and shareholder agreements, documents that changed the architecture of entire markets. This one just changed the architecture of a marriage nobody believed in anymore. Vivian Blackwell stood by the window, her silver hair pulled into the same severe chignon she'd worn for 30 years, pearls that cost more than most people's cars resting against her throat like a collar of old money and older expectations. She didn't smile, not exactly, but something in her posture relaxed. Shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch that spoke volumes her mouth would never articulate. Victory looked quiet on her. It always had. Arthur Graves, the attorney, slid the papers across to the other side of the table with the reverence of a man handling volatile substances. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from age or the peculiar tension filling the room like static before lightning, Grayson couldn't tell. Sienna sat there in that cardigan. The gray one with the fraying cuffs she'd owned since before they'd married, probably since her college days at some state school nobody in the Blackwell circle had ever heard of. Her hair fell in soft waves around her face. No salon highlights, no architectural styling, just brown hair that caught the dim light and held it without demanding attention. She picked up the document, and Grayson found himself watching her eyes move across the pages. Not the way someone reads a story, but the way an engineer reads a blueprint. Fast, surgical. Her pupils tracked left to right with mechanical precision, and he felt something cold slide down his spine. 45 seconds. That's how long it took her to flip through 18 pages of dense legal language, prenuptial clauses, asset divisions, custody agreements for possessions neither of them cared about. When she reached page 12, her finger paused on Section 4, subsection B, the irrevocable waiver clause, the one Arthur had spent 3 weeks crafting to ensure she couldn't come back later claiming ignorance, couldn't petition for discovery of Blackwell Capital's internal finances, couldn't pierce the corporate veil no matter what she thought she might deserve. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly, counting something. Then she flipped to page 15, found Section 7, Clause 3. The non-disclosure agreement, confidentiality, binding in perpetuity regarding all Blackwell family business matters, investment strategies, personal affairs, private communications. She looked up at Arthur, and for just a moment Grayson saw something in her expression that made his mouth go dry. You structured this to mirror the Kensington-Rothwell dissolution from 2019. Sections 4 and 7 are almost word-for-word identical, except you changed business entities to family enterprises to broaden the scope. Clever. Arthur's face went pale. Vivian turned from the window slowly, the way a hawk turns its head when it spots movement in tall grass. Grayson heard his own voice before he'd decided to speak. You studied law. Sienna didn't look at him. She was reading Section 9 now, the property division schedule. No, but I've read a lot of M&A contracts. You absorb the patterns. M&A contracts. Vivian's voice could have etched glass. And where exactly would you have encountered merger and acquisition agreements, dear? The volunteer coordinator position at Tomorrow's Scholars Foundation doesn't typically involve corporate restructuring. The silence stretched like taffy, sweet and dangerous. Rain continued its assault on the windows. Somewhere 42 floors below Manhattan went about its business, oblivious to the small implosion happening in this expensive room with its leather chairs and its oil paintings of men who'd been dead for a century. Sienna signed. One fluid motion, the kind of signature that comes from signing important documents frequently enough that your hand knows the rhythm without conscious thought. Then she set down the pen, and for the first time since Grayson had asked for this divorce 3 months ago, she looked directly at him. I don't want the settlement. Arthur made a sound like a tire deflating. Vivian's pearls clicked softly as she took a sharp breath. Grayson found himself leaning forward. The settlement is generous. $100,000 the apartment in Queens, the car. You'd be set for at least 2 years while you find your footing." "I have my footing." Sienna stood smoothing her skirt with hands that didn't shake at all. "I have my own resources. You can keep the money, the apartment, all of it. I don't need anything from the Blackwell estate." The words hung there impossible and clean. Vivian moved toward the table, her heels making small, precise sounds against the hardwood. "Resources." What resources could you possibly have that would make $100,000 insignificant? Sienna gathered her purse, a canvas bag she'd bought at some farmer's market years ago, the kind of thing Cordelia had mocked at every family gathering. "Enough to live comfortably. That's all that matters." She walked to the door, and Grayson felt something close to panic rising in his chest, though he couldn't name why. This was what he wanted, what they all wanted. Freedom from the mistake he'd made 3 years ago when he'd thought quiet and gentle meant the same as compatible, when he'd believed love could exist separate from ambition, that he could partition his life into the ruthless and the tender and keep both halves functioning. Her hand rested on the doorknob and she paused, just for a heartbeat. When she spoke again, her voice carried something he'd never heard before. Not anger, not sadness, something colder and more certain. "Grayson, I hope Blackwell Capital's IPO goes well next month. I know how hard you've worked on the Meridian Technologies partnership proposal. It would be a shame if that fell through." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded to Grayson's ears like a lock turning. He stared at the space where she'd been standing, his brain trying to process what had just happened. Vivian broke the silence first, her voice sharp with something that might have been concern if she'd ever allowed herself that particular weakness. "How did she know about Meridian?" Grayson shook his head slowly. "I never mentioned it. Not once. We've been pursuing them for 18 months and I've never brought work home. It's all been confidential board meetings, encrypted emails." Arthur gathered the papers with unsteady hands. "Perhaps she overheard something. The walls in these old buildings, you know." But Grayson didn't know, because he did know that Sienna had never been to the Blackwell Capital offices, had never attended the dinners where business got discussed in low voices over brandy and cigars. She'd been to charity galas, sure, but she'd spent those evenings in corners talking to caterers and coat-check girls, invisible in the way certain people master when they don't want to be seen. 3 years. They'd been married 3 years, and he realized with a kind of vertigo that he didn't actually know what she did with most of her time. The volunteer work, yes, but that was part-time at best. 2 days a week, maybe 3. Where was she the other days? He'd assumed shopping or book clubs or whatever it was that wives did when their husbands were building empires. The thought shamed him now, its casual dismissiveness. But shame was easier than the alternative creeping into his consciousness, that maybe he'd never known her at all. The memory surfaced unbidden from 2 weeks after they'd married. He'd been working on the consolidated media pitch, 60-hour weeks, numbers swimming in his vision every time he closed his eyes. He'd come home at 2 in the morning to find her still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open. His work laptop, the one with the encrypted partition and the VPN access to Blackwell Capital's internal servers. She'd looked up startled and closed it quickly. Too quickly. "I couldn't sleep. I was just browsing." He'd been too exhausted to press, too trusting to question. Now the memory felt different, lit from another angle. The way her fingers had moved across the keyboard before she'd noticed him. Fast. Confident. Not browsing. Working. Vivian's voice cut through his reverie. "We need to focus on the IPO. Sienna is yesterday's problem. Tomorrow's problem is securing the capital we need to take Blackwell public before the market window closes." She was right, of course. Vivian was always right about business, even when she was catastrophically wrong about everything else. The IPO had been 2 years in the making, every asset optimized, every liability buried or restructured, every narrative polished until it gleamed like new money trying to look old. They'd go public in 6 weeks, raise $300 million, and cement the Blackwell name among the serious players in the Northeast Financial Corridor. Unless something went wrong. The drive back to the Blackwell estate took 40 minutes through traffic that moved like cold honey. Grayson sat in the back of the town car, watching rain-slicked streets slide past, trying not to think about the way Sienna had read those contracts, the precision of her observations, The casual mention of Meridian Technologies, like she'd plucked the name from his thoughts. His phone buzzed. Alessandra Monroe's name lit up the screen, and he felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with her texts now. Anticipation mixed with something darker, something that tasted like betrayal. Even though the marriage was over, the papers signed, the whole charade finally ended. Dinner tonight, I have news about the Monroe Ventures expansion. Plus, I miss you. 3 months. That's how long it had been since he'd first kissed Alessandra in the coat check room at the Gatsby Foundation. Benefit, her mouth tasting like champagne, and ambition, her hands in his hair, while his wife sat 20 feet away, making polite conversation with the event coordinator. 3 months of stolen afternoons in hotel rooms that cost more per night than most people's monthly rent of text messages deleted as soon as they were read, of a kind of aliveness he hadn't felt since before marriage had become just another obligation to manage. He typed back 8 o'clock, the usual place. The estate materialized through the rain like something from another century, all stone and ivy and windows that had witnessed 100 years of Blackwell triumphs and failures. Cordelia's BMW sat in the circular drive, cherry red and aggressive, bought with money from a trust fund she'd never had to earn. His sister had opinions about everything and expertise in nothing, a combination that made family dinners feel like running through a maze while someone threw knives. She met him in the foyer, already talking before he'd closed the door. Finally. Mother's been on the phone with Arthur for 20 minutes, and she's using her ice voice, which means something went wrong. Did the little mouse ask for more money? Try to renegotiate. Grayson handed his coat to Stevens, the butler who'd been with the family since before Grayson was born, a man whose face had forgotten how to show surprise decades ago. She didn't ask for anything. She refused the settlement entirely. Cordelia's perfectly shaped eyebrows lifted. Refused it? As in turned down $100,000 in a free apartment? Is she brain damaged? She said she has her own resources. His sister laughed, the sound sharp and bright and cruel. Resources. Right. What resources? Her collection of second-hand cardigans, her extensive network of non-profit volunteers. The woman shops at Target Grayson. I've seen the tags on her clothes. But something in her voice wavered at the end just slightly, and Grayson realized Cordelia had heard it too. The wrongness of it all. The pieces that didn't fit into the narrative they'd built around Sienna, the story of the charity case who'd gotten lucky and married up and then couldn't handle the altitude. Vivian emerged from the study, phone in hand, her expression carved from granite and old grudges. Arthur says the dissolution is final. She can't contest it now, can't claim duress or coercion. It's done. Why would she contest it? Grayson heard the edge in his own voice. She's the one who refused the money. His mother's eyes, the same ice-chip blue as his own, studied him with the intensity of a jeweler examining a stone for flaws. People like Sienna don't refuse money unless they have access to more, or unless they're planning something that requires them to appear magnanimous. Neither option is comforting. Cordelia kicked off her heels, leaving them on the marble floor where Stevens would collect them later with the patient resignation of someone long accustomed to cleaning up after careless wealth. You're both being paranoid. She probably has some inheritance from a dead aunt or something. $5,000 feels like a fortune when you've never had money. She'll burn through it in a year and realize she should have taken the settlement. But Vivian shook her head slowly. Women like Sienna, the ones who make themselves small and quiet and forgettable, they're either genuinely powerless or they're hiding something. I've lived long enough to know the difference. And I watched her at family dinners for 3 years. She never looked powerless. She looked patient. The words settled over the foyer like frost. Grayson thought about patience, about the way Sienna had sat through dozens of dinners, while Vivian made cutting remarks about her clothes, her background, her lack of connections or pedigree. Never fighting back, never defending herself, just sitting there with that gentle smile and those quiet hands and those eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. He'd thought it was weakness, the inability to stand up for herself. Now he wondered if it had been strategy, if she'd been waiting for something, accumulating information like a data analyst, storing every slight and every secret for some purpose he'd been too arrogant to imagine. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus, his closest friend and the chief legal counsel at Blackwell Capital, the man who'd been trying to set up the Meridian Technologies partnership for 18 months with nothing but polite rejections and vague promises to show for it. "Call me. It's about Meridian." They finally responded. Grayson's pulse quickened. Meridian Technologies was the white whale, the company that could transform Blackwell Capital from a respectable regional player into a national force. They'd developed some kind of proprietary AI security algorithm that was apparently years ahead of anything else on the market, so advanced that the NSA had tried to classify it and failed. Getting Meridian as a partner, getting access to their technology for Blackwell's financial security division would be worth $50 million in new contracts before the end of the quarter. But Meridian had been a ghost for 2 years, ever since their mysterious CEO had stepped back from public operations. Nobody knew who ran the company anymore. Emails went unanswered. Calls led to voicemail boxes that were perpetually full. It was like trying to court a phantom. He stepped into his father's old study, the room he'd claimed after the funeral 5 years ago, surrounded by books his father had never read and diplomas from schools that mattered more for their names than their education. The whiskey decanter sat on the sidebar cut crystal that caught the dying light from the windows and broke it into tiny rainbows nobody was looking at. Marcus answered on the first ring. They sent a response to our partnership proposal. Finally, after 18 months of silence. And it's weird. It's not a yes or a no. It's an invitation to the Tech Vision Gala in 6 weeks, November 15th. They say if we want to discuss partnership terms, we should attend. They'll have a representative there. Grayson poured 2 fingers of whiskey, watched the amber liquid catch the light. That's it. No counter-proposal, no preliminary terms, just show up at a party. That's it. But Grayson, here's the strange part. The invitation came through a personal email address, not the corporate one, and it was sent to you specifically, not to Blackwell Capital. To your personal email, the one you don't give out to business contacts. The whiskey turned to ice in his throat. What address? The Gmail, the one you set up in college and kept for personal correspondence. Only a handful of people had that email. Family, close friends, and Sienna, because he'd given it to her when they were dating, when he'd still believed in the romance of having one identity for the world and another for the person you loved. Forward me the email. Already did. Grayson opened his laptop and there it was. Sender m.laurent@meridiantech.com. Subject Partnership Inquiry. The message itself was brief, almost perfunctory. Mr. Blackwell, after careful consideration of your repeated proposals, Meridian Technologies is prepared to discuss potential collaboration. We invite you to attend the Tech Vision Gala on November 15th at the Plaza Hotel, where our executive team will be available for preliminary conversations. Please RSVP by November 1st. We look forward to meeting you in person. Regards, M. Laurent, Office of the CEO. M. Laurent. He searched his memory for the name, came up empty. Meridian's founder had been someone else, a MIT graduate whose name had circulated in tech circles a decade ago before vanishing into the same mysterious silence that now surrounded the company. This Laurent person was new, or at least new to him. He called Marcus back. Did you run background on Monsieur Laurent? Tried, hit a wall, no LinkedIn, no social media, no public records beyond a business registration in Delaware from 2019. It's like they don't exist outside of Meridian. Everyone exists somewhere. Not if they don't want to be found. Look, maybe it's just corporate paranoia. Tech companies are weird about privacy, especially the ones dealing with security software. Could be standard operational procedure. But Grayson's instincts, the ones that had kept him alive in the shark tank of high finance for 15 years, were screaming that nothing about this was standard. The timing felt wrong. The personal email felt wrong. The whole careful choreography of 18 months of silence followed by a sudden invitation felt like a play he'd walked into halfway through, missing the context that would make the next act make sense. He spent the next hour trying to focus on the IPO prospectus, the offering price calculations, the roadshow schedule that would take him to 7 cities in 2 weeks once they filed with the SEC. But his mind kept circling back to Sienna, to the way she'd refused the money to her casual mention of Meridian, like she was dropping breadcrumbs for him to follow. By 7:30 he'd given up on work. He changed into the clothes Alessandra liked, the casual expensive ones that said money without screaming it, and drove himself into the city. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't have a sign where reservations required connections and discretion cost extra, but came standard. They had a corner booth, always the same one, where the lighting was gentle and the walls were thick enough to swallow conversations. Alessandra was already there, legs crossed, wine glass half empty, looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread on what female ambition was supposed to look like when it dressed for dinner. Black dress, simple jewelry, hair that had cost 4 hours and $500 to look that effortlessly perfect. She stood to kiss him, and he let himself fall into it for a moment. The familiar warmth of her mouth, the scent of her perfume that probably cost more per ounce than gold. This was easier. This made sense. A woman who understood his world, who spoke his language, who wanted the same things he wanted, and didn't apologize for the wanting. "You look tense." She traced a finger along his jaw as they sat. "Rough day closing out the marriage." "Strange day." He signaled the waiter for his usual scotch. She refused the settlement. Alessandra's hand paused halfway to her wine glass. Refused it how? Refused it entirely. Said she had her own resources, didn't need anything from the Blackwell estate. For just a moment something flickered across Alessandra's face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. It passed so quickly he almost thought he'd imagined it. "Well, good for her, I suppose. Very dignified." "You don't seem shocked." She laughed, but it sounded slightly off-key. "Should I be? Maybe she has savings. Maybe she's going back to family. Not everyone needs a golden parachute to survive a divorce, Grayson." She mentioned Meridian Technologies, knew about the partnership proposal we've been working on. This time the reaction was unmistakable. Alessandra went very still, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass, just enough to make the liquid inside tremble. How would she know about that? That's what I'd like to understand. The waiter arrived with his scotch, giving Alessandra time to rearrange her expression into something neutral and sympathetic. Corporate espionage Blackwell Capital must have hundreds of employees. Maybe someone talked and it filtered through social circles. You know how people gossip. But that didn't feel right either. The Meridian proposal had been locked down tight, limited to himself, Marcus, and Vivian. Need to know only. Because if their competitors got wind they were courting Meridian, the bidding war would drive the price into territory they couldn't afford. Alessandra reached across the table, laced her fingers through his. "Forget about Sienna. Forget about Meridian for one night. I have good news. Monroe Ventures closed the Series B funding. $60 million. We're expanding into 3 new markets next quarter." He should have been happy for her. Should have toasted her success. Asked about her plans, played the role of supportive partner, the way he'd failed to play it with Sienna. But all he could think about was that initial, the M in M. Laurent, and the way Sienna's middle name on her MIT diploma had been abbreviated to just a letter, because the full name wouldn't fit in the formal calligraphy. The dinner passed in a blur of conversation he wasn't fully present for. Alessandra talked about her expansion plans, about the investors she'd courted, about the office space she'd leased in Chicago. He made the appropriate sounds, asked the right questions, but his mind was elsewhere, circling the same drain of questions that had no answers. Afterward, in the hotel room that had become their usual refuge, her hands on his skin felt like a betrayal of something he couldn't name. Not his marriage, which was dead and buried, but something deeper. Some fundamental honesty he'd lost track of in the pursuit of things that had seemed important until they suddenly didn't. She fell asleep around midnight, her breathing deep and even, one arm thrown across his chest in a possessiveness that felt both comforting and suffocating. Grayson stared at the ceiling, watching shadows from the city lights outside paint abstract patterns on the plaster, and tried to remember when he'd last felt certain about anything. His phone, charging on the nightstand, buzzed softly. A text from a number he didn't recognize. "You asked about resources. Tomorrow's Scholars Foundation Annual Report, 2019 to 2023. Check the major donors list." page 17. No name, no signature. He should have deleted it, should have ignored obvious bait from unknown sources. Instead, he carefully extracted himself from Alessandra's sleeping form, grabbed his phone and laptop, and moved to the bathroom where he could work without waking her. Tomorrow's Scholars was the nonprofit where Sienna volunteered the literacy program for underprivileged kids that she'd devoted 2 or 3 days a week to for the entire duration of their marriage. He'd been to one of their events early on before Vivian had made it clear that attending charity functions with his wife sent the wrong message about Blackwell Capital's target demographic. Finding the annual report took 10 minutes of searching their website. It was a glossy digital publication full of photos of smiling children and testimonials from teachers and statistics about reading levels. He skipped to page 17. The major donors section listed contributions over $10,000. The usual suspects appeared old money foundations, tech company community outreach programs, wealthy individuals buying tax deductions, and social capital. He scanned the list once, found nothing, scanned it again slower, and their fourth from the bottom listed under corporate donors. Meridian Technologies, LLC, $250,000 annually, 2019 to 2023. His hand shook slightly as he clicked through to the donor profile, hoping for more information. The entry was sparse. Just the dollar amount, the years, and a single line of text. Corporate donation administered through the Office of the CEO, distributed quarterly to support literacy programs in underserved communities. Office of the CEO, M. Laurent. He sat on the edge of the bathtub, the cold porcelain shocking against his skin through his boxers, and felt the world tilt sideways. $250,000 a year for 4 years. To a nonprofit where his wife volunteered. Administered by someone with the same abbreviated initial as Sienna's middle name. It could be coincidence. The world was full of coincidences that meant nothing, random alignments of circumstance that looked like patterns only because human brains were wired to find meaning in chaos. But Grayson had built a career on reading patterns, on seeing the connections other people missed, on understanding that in business coincidence was usually just conspiracy wearing a thin disguise. He thought about Sienna sitting in the back of board meetings for tomorrow's Scholars, the few times he'd dropped her off when her car was in the shop. The way she'd moved through those rooms, not like a volunteer, but like someone who owned the space in some fundamental way. The respect in people's voices when they spoke to her, a deference he'd attributed to natural kindness, but which now seemed like something else entirely. The days she disappeared 2 or 3 times a week, always with the same vague explanation. Meetings at the foundation, strategy sessions, donor relations. His phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. The Tech Vision Gala isn't random. Check the guest list when it goes public next week. Look for the keynote speaker announcement. Then 5 seconds later, stop digging, Grayson. Some mysteries are better left buried. But you were never good at leaving things alone. That's why I loved you. Was. Past tense. Loved. Past tense. He stared at the screen until the words blurred, trying to recognize Sienna's voice in the text, trying to hear her saying those words in that gentle tone she'd used for 3 years, while his family eviscerated her dignity piece by piece at formal dinners. When he finally crawled back into bed, Alessandra stirred, mumbled something about morning meetings, and curled into him with the easy trust of someone who believed she knew all his secrets. He lay there in the dark, listening to her breathe, and wondered how many secrets you could keep before you forgot which version of yourself was real. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange suspension between normal life and creeping paranoia. The IPO preparations consumed his days, meetings with underwriters and analysts and SEC attorneys who asked questions designed to find the weak spots in their armor. Cordelia managed to get herself fired from the marketing department of Blackwell Capital after spending $4 million on a rebrand that tested worse than the original with every focus group, but Vivian smoothed it over with the board, spun it as a strategic realignment rather than spectacular incompetence. Grayson saw Alessandra 4 times each encounter, feeling more like performance art than intimacy. She talked about her expansion, her investors, her plans to take Monroe Ventures public within 2 years. She never mentioned Sienna again, but sometimes he'd catch her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, like she was waiting for him to figure out something obvious that everyone else already knew. The TechVision Gala guest list went public on November 1st, exactly when the anonymous texts had promised. He downloaded the PDF at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep. Alessandra absent for once because of some crisis at her Chicago office. 400 expected attendees, every major player in the Northeast tech corridor. Venture capitalists, startup founders, established companies looking to network and poach talent. And there on the first page, highlighted in bold, keynote speaker Sienna L. Ashford, CEO and founder, Meridian Technologies. The future of AI security building systems that protect what matters. The phone slipped from his fingers, clattered onto the hardwood floor. He stared at the screen, reading the words over and over, waiting for them to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. CEO. Founder. Sienna L. Ashford, not M. Laurent. That had been the abbreviated version, the corporate anonymity she'd hidden behind. But the keynote announcement used her full name, her real name, the one he'd signed on a marriage license 3 years ago without ever asking what the L stood for. He grabbed his laptop, started searching. Sienna Laurent Ashford. But there was nothing. No public records, no social media, no trail of digital breadcrumbs that should exist for someone who'd supposedly founded and run a multi-billion-dollar tech company. Then he tried a different approach. Searched for Meridian Technologies, founding date, SEC, filings, patent registrations. Found a Delaware incorporation from 2013, 13 years ago, filed by someone named S. Laurent. Searched MIT computer science graduates 2013, cross-referenced with the initial S. And there she was, small photo in a graduation announcement. Younger, same gentle features, but with something in her eyes that the Sienna he'd known had learned to hide. Fierce and focused and absolutely certain. Sienna Laurent. Bachelor's and master's degrees in artificial intelligence and cryptographic systems. Thesis on quantum-resistant encryption algorithms. Graduated summa cum laude at age 22. The same year Meridian Technologies was incorporated. He read everything he could find about that younger version of his wife, the one who'd existed before she'd decided to become invisible. Academic papers co-authored with professors whose names meant something in tech circles. A brief mention in a Wired article about promising young AI researchers. A single photograph from a symposium in 2015 standing next to people whose companies were now worth billions. Her smile small and private, like she knew something they didn't. Then nothing. Complete silence after 2019, as if Sienna Laurent had simply ceased to exist, replaced by the quiet woman who volunteered at literacy programs and wore second-hand cardigans and let her husband's family treat her like charitable obligation. Dawn came without him noticing pink light bleeding across the skyline, and he was still sitting there surrounded by printouts and browser tabs and the ruins of everything he'd thought he understood about the last 3 years. His phone rang. Marcus' voice tight with something between excitement and terror. "Did you see the keynote announcement?" Grayson's throat was so dry he could barely speak. "I saw it." "Grayson, your ex-wife. Your ex-wife is the CEO of Meridian Technologies, the company we've been trying to court for 18 months, the company that's worth somewhere between 3 and 8 billion depending on whose valuation you trust. Your wife, the one your mother called dead weight at family dinners." "I know." "Did you know before the divorce?" "No." "Does Vivian know?" "Not yet." Silence. Then Marcus laughed, the sound slightly unhinged. "This is going to be the most awkward gala in the history of technology networking events. Please tell me you're still planning to attend." "I'm attending." "Should I prepare damage control? Legal wants to know if we need to file any disclosures with the SEC about prior relationships with potential partners." Grayson closed his eyes, felt the walls of his carefully constructed life collapsing inward like a controlled demolition. "Tell legal we're fine. There's no conflict of interest in courting a company your ex-wife founded and runs. It's just spectacularly humiliating." He ended the call, then immediately dialed Vivian. She answered on the 4th ring, voice crisp despite the early hour. "Mother, we need to talk about Sienna." What about her? She's the CEO of Meridian Technologies. The silence that followed was so profound he checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When Vivian finally spoke, her voice carried a quality he'd never heard before. Not anger. Something closer to respect, bitter and cold, but unmistakably real. How long have you known? I found out 30 minutes ago. The Tech Vision Gala keynote announcement. And she said nothing. For 3 years. Sat at our table, let Cordelia mock her clothes, let me call her unambitious, and never once corrected the record. Vivian laughed, sharp and brief. That's not weakness, Grayson. That's strategy. And we didn't even see it coming. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in forced normalcy, while everything underneath churned like water about to boil. Vivian insisted they maintain their usual schedule, attend the same events, show no weakness to the business community that would smell blood in the water and circle accordingly. Cordelia oscillated between denial and rage, unable to reconcile the woman she'd spent 3 years dismissing with the reality of what Sienna had built. Alessandra went quiet, stopped initiating contact, and when Grayson asked why, she just smiled sadly and said, "Because you're about to see her again, and I don't want to be the person standing between you and whatever that conversation needs to be." The gala arrived with the inevitability of winter November 15th, bringing cold rain and wind that rattled windows and made the city feel fragile. Grayson stood in his bedroom at the estate, adjusting his bow tie in the mirror, and felt like he was preparing for an execution. His own, probably. The Plaza Hotel had been transformed into something between a technology showcase and a high society ball, all elegant lighting and strategic branding, and beautiful people pretending their conversations were casual when everyone was calculating the value of every interaction. Vivian moved through the crowd like a shark in pearls, Cordelia trailing behind in a dress that cost more than most people's cars, both of them scanning for Sienna with the intensity of hunters tracking dangerous prey. The announcement came at 8:30. The crowd hushed, attention shifting to the grand staircase where speakers traditionally made their entrance. Grayson felt his heart hammering against his ribs, mouth-dry hands clenched so tight his knuckles ached. The doors opened. Security personnel came through first, discreet but unmistakable. Then she appeared, and the air left his lungs in a rush. Sienna descended the staircase in a column of white that caught every light in the room and transformed it into something celestial. Gone was the cardigan, the bargain store dress, the careful invisibility. Her hair fell in waves that must have taken hours to achieve, styled with the casual perfection that only vast amounts of money could buy. Sapphires at her throat caught light and threw it back like controlled lightning, each stone probably worth more than the entire settlement she'd refused. But it was her face that stopped him cold. She looked the same and entirely different, like seeing someone step out of a disguise they'd worn so long you'd forgotten it wasn't real. The same gentle features, but arranged now with an assurance that made it clear the gentleness was a choice, not a default. She reached the bottom of the stairs, and the room erupted in polite applause that couldn't quite hide the undercurrent of shock running through everyone who'd ever seen her at a Blackwell function, quiet and forgettable in the background. The MC stepped forward, a tech journalist whose name Grayson couldn't remember through the static in his brain. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to introduce someone who needs no introduction to anyone in this industry, though many of you are seeing her face for the first time. The founder and CEO of Meridian Technologies, the mind behind the encryption algorithms that protect 90% of global financial transactions, the woman who revolutionized AI security while most of us were still trying to figure out what AI stood for. Please welcome Sienna Laurent Ashford." Laurent. The middle name he'd never known, the initial that had seemed meaningless on her MIT diploma. Her maiden name kept hidden in plain sight. She stepped forward, and her eyes swept the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years reading rooms for threats and opportunities. They landed on Grayson, held for just a fraction of a second longer than random chance would dictate, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, something colder and more satisfied. Then she was moving through the crowd, stopped by admirers and business partners, people who wanted 5 minutes of her attention like it was currency they could trade later. Vivian stood frozen beside him, and he heard her whisper more to herself than to him. "We've been trying to court her company for 18 months. She sat at our dinner table twice a week for 3 years. She knew. She always knew. Grayson couldn't speak. He watched Sienna field questions with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, watched her laugh at something a venture capitalist said, watched her exist in this world like she'd been born to it, which apparently she had been. Alessandra appeared at his elbow, face carefully neutral. "You should go talk to her." "I don't know what to say." "Start with the truth. You didn't know. You were an idiot. You're sorry." She squeezed his arm gently. "And Grayson, I was wrong earlier. I do want to be standing between you and that conversation, but not for the reasons you think." Before he could ask what she meant, Alessandra was walking away, moving toward Sienna, with the determination of someone who'd made a decision and was committed to seeing it through, regardless of consequences. He watched them meet, watched Alessandra say something he couldn't hear, watched Sienna's expression shift from polite interest to something sharper. They talked for perhaps 90 seconds. Then Alessandra nodded once and walked away. Not back toward Grayson, but toward the exit out into the November rain and away from the wreckage of whatever she'd just detonated. Sienna stood there alone for a moment, something unreadable flickering across her face. Then she turned and her eyes found his across the expanse of elegant strangers, and he knew with perfect certainty that everything he'd thought he'd understood about the last 3 years had been a carefully constructed fiction. She didn't come to him. She just watched patient as winter waiting for him to make the choice. Walk away or walk toward the truth. The distance between them couldn't have been more than 50 feet, but it felt like crossing a border into hostile territory without a passport. Grayson's legs moved before his brain finished processing the decision, carrying him through clusters of tech executives and venture capitalists who parted without seeming to notice their attention, still fixed on the woman in white who'd just rewritten everyone's understanding of the past 3 years. Sienna watched him approach with the same expression she'd worn at family dinners when Vivian had made remarks about her lack of sophistication. Calm, patient, absolutely lethal underneath. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the sapphires at her throat pulse with her heartbeat far enough that touching her would require deliberate choice rather than accident. The noise of the gala continued around them, a soundtrack of wealth networking with ambition, but inside their small radius of space, silence pressed down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. "You built Meridian." The words came out rougher than he'd intended, accusation and awe fighting for dominance in his throat. "I did. 13 years ago, from your dorm room at MIT. Actually, from my apartment. The dorm had terrible internet." Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like muscle memory of friendliness that had been trained out of her. "You've been researching." "Someone sent me breadcrumbs, anonymous texts, the donor list at tomorrow's scholars. I assume that was you." "Thaddeus, actually. My attorney. He thought you deserved a warning before tonight." I disagreed, but he can be sentimental about marriage vows even when they're already broken. Grayson felt something crack in his chest, small and sharp as a fracture in ice. "You let us believe you were nobody. For 3 years. You sat through dinners while my mother called you dead weight, while Cordelia mocked your clothes, while I—" He stopped. Couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't articulate the full scope of his failure out loud in this room full of people who traded on perception. Sienna's expression didn't change. "While what Grayson ignored me, dismissed me, started sleeping with Alessandra Monroe 4 months before asking for a divorce." She took a sip from her champagne glass, the motion elegant and controlled. "I'm aware of the timeline." The mention of Alessandra sent heat flooding his face. "How long have you known about that?" "Since the first time you kissed her in the coat check at the Gatsby Foundation benefit. I was 20 feet away talking to the event coordinator about dietary restrictions for the spring luncheon. You thought I wasn't paying attention. I'm always paying attention." Someone laughed nearby, oblivious to the quiet demolition happening in their vicinity. A waiter drifted past with champagne flutes, and Grayson had to resist the urge to grab one and drain it just to have something to do with his hands. "Why didn't you say anything if you knew? If you'd always known I was cheating, why not confront me? Why not end it then?" "Because I needed to see how far you'd go. How completely you'd choose them over me. How thoroughly you'd prove that what I built, who I am, what I'm capable of, none of that mattered compared to surface appearances and old money approval. She shifted her weight slightly, and the dress moved like liquid mercury catching light and throwing it back transformed. You exceeded my expectations. Congratulations. Marcus appeared at the edge of his peripheral vision, probably trying to signal him to step away to stop making whatever scene was about to unfold worse than it already was. Grayson ignored him. This was a test. Our entire marriage was you testing me. No. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes that looked almost like pain. Our marriage was me loving you. The test was what happened after love stopped being enough to make you see me as human. You failed, Grayson. Spectacularly, but I learned what I needed to know, which was that disguising strength as weakness is the most effective camouflage money can't buy. She set down her champagne glass on a passing tray. The keynote starts in 15 minutes. I need to prepare. I'm sure we'll talk again soon, given that Blackwell Capital is desperately trying to secure a partnership with Meridian, though I should mention that your proposal is currently third on my priority list. Monroe Ventures and Hartfield Industries both submitted more compelling terms. Monroe Ventures, Alessandra's company. The piece clicked into place with sickening clarity. She knew. Alessandra knew who you were. She's known for 4 months. Since right around the time you first kissed her, actually. I called her the next morning, told her exactly who I was and exactly what you'd done. Suggested she might want to reconsider getting involved with a man who couldn't recognize value when he was married to it. Sienna's smile sharpened into something that would draw blood if you pressed against it. She decided to proceed anyway. Said it wasn't personal, just business. The opportunity to get close to Blackwell Capital's IPO plans was too valuable to pass up. The floor felt unstable beneath his feet, like the marble had turned to water, and he was sinking through it into some darker space where nothing made sense. You're lying. I rarely lie, Grayson. I just selectively reveal truth. There's a difference. She turned to go, then paused. Oh, and that SEC investigation into insider trading, the one that's been making your accountants nervous. You might want to ask Vivian about the code she purchased from a former Meridian employee in 2021. The algorithm that's been generating above-market returns for Blackwell Capital's proprietary trading division. The one that doesn't actually belong to her. She walked away before he could respond, moving toward the stage where her keynote would transform her from curiosity into threat in the minds of every person in the room who'd underestimated her. Grayson stood there feeling like he'd been hit by a truck driven by his own ignorance, trying to process revelations coming too fast to catalog. Vivian materialized beside him, her face carved from granite and fury. Tell me she didn't just say what I think she said about the trading algorithm. She knows about the code. She knows you bought it. His mother's hand clenched around her pearl necklace hard enough that the string might snap. That was a legitimate purchase from a former employee who left Meridian with no non-compete clause in place. Perfectly legal. Was it their code to sell? The silence that followed was answer enough. Grayson watched his mother's face cycle through calculations, weighing liability against potential exposure, trying to determine how catastrophic this could become if Sienna decided to pursue it legally. We need damage control, now. Call Arthur, get him to reach out to Meridian's legal team, see if we can negotiate a retroactive licensing agreement before this becomes public. Vivian's voice had gone cold and tactical, the tone she used when markets were crashing and decisions needed to happen faster than thought. And you need to fix whatever you just broke with Sienna. That partnership is worth more than your pride. You want me to apologize my way into a business deal with my ex-wife. I want you to do whatever is necessary to keep Blackwell Capital from becoming a cautionary tale about corporate theft. If that means groveling, grovel. If that means offering her a board seat, offer it. If that means getting on your knees in front of 400 people and begging forgiveness, then I suggest you invest in good knee pads. She walked away, already pulling out her phone, leaving Grayson alone in a crowd of strangers who were all trying not to look like they'd overheard everything. Cordelia found him next, her face flushed with champagne and embarrassment. "Is it true? Did she really build Meridian? The whole thing?" "Yes. But she was so... She wore Old Navy Grayson. I saw the tags. How can someone who's worth billions shop at Old Navy? Maybe because she didn't need expensive clothes to know her own value, unlike some people." His sister's face crumpled slightly, and he felt a twinge of guilt for the cruelty. Cordelia was vapid and careless, but she'd been raised that way, taught that appearance was currency and substance was optional. She was a product of the same system that had blinded him to everything real about Sienna. The lights dimmed. The crowd shifted toward the stage, expensive bodies arranging themselves in hierarchies of importance and interest. Grayson found himself pushed toward the front by the general flow, ending up with a clear view of Sienna as she stepped into the spotlight. She didn't use notes, didn't even glance at the teleprompter, just stood there in that white dress with her sapphires catching every light, and began to speak about artificial intelligence and security with the casual mastery of someone explaining water to fish. She talked about encryption as if it were poetry, about algorithms as if they were living things that needed care and feeding and ethical constraints. The audience was hypnotized. Grayson could see it in their faces, the shift from polite attention to genuine fascination as Sienna laid out her vision for AI security that could adapt to threats faster than human hackers could evolve them. She didn't talk down to them, didn't simplify beyond what clarity required, trusted them to keep up with her or fall behind according to their own capacity. Halfway through, she paused and looked directly at where Vivian stood near the back, her face illuminated by the stage lights, eyes dark as deep water. "Someone asked me recently why Meridian stayed private for so long while competitors went public and became household names. The answer is simple. Going public means transparency. It means letting people see your code, your strategies, your vulnerabilities. And I learned a long time ago that the moment you let people see who you really are, they'll use that knowledge however it benefits them most. Privacy isn't paranoia, it's survival." The words landed like stones thrown through glass, shattering any pretense that this keynote was purely professional. This was personal. This was Sienna, standing on stage in front of the entire Northeast Tech Corridor and explaining exactly why she'd hidden herself for 3 years, exactly what she'd been protecting, exactly what had been at stake every time Vivian had called her unambitious or Cordelia had mocked her wardrobe. She finished to standing ovation that went on long enough to become awkward, people unsure when to stop clapping for someone who'd just redefined their entire industry's approach to security, while simultaneously delivering the most elegant middle finger to conventional wisdom anyone had ever witnessed. The reception afterward was chaos masquerading as networking. Grayson tried 3 times to get close to Sienna, was blocked each time by people with better connections or more compelling business proposals. He watched from across the room as executives lined up to talk to her, as venture capitalists tried to pitch investment opportunities, as the entire machinery of tech wealth pivoted to accommodate this new player who'd been hiding in plain sight. Alessandra found him at the bar nursing a scotch he didn't remember ordering. She looked different than she had an hour ago, some of the polish worn away to reveal exhaustion underneath. "She told you," not a question, "that you knew who she was for 4 months?" "Yes." "Why didn't you mention it?" "Because it wasn't my secret to tell, and because I was trying to protect you from your own stupidity." She ordered vodka, Neat drank half of it in one swallow. "I called her the morning after we first kissed. Wanted to make sure there weren't going to be complications, that she wasn't going to make my life difficult for getting involved with her husband." She laughed. Actually laughed Grayson. "Then she said you'd already made your choice by not making a choice, and I was welcome to whatever was left. You used me to get to the IPO information. I used a mutually beneficial situation to advance my business interests while also enjoying your company. Don't pretend you're shocked. This is how our world works. We're all using each other for something." The cynicism of it made his stomach turn, though he couldn't deny the truth underneath. He'd used Alessandra too as an escape from a marriage that felt like obligation, as proof that he was still desirable despite Vivian's constant implications that he'd married down. Did you ever actually want me? Or was it always just strategy? Alessandra finished her vodka, set the glass down with careful precision. I wanted you. I also wanted access to Blackwell Capital's financial projections. People contain multitudes, Grayson. We're all more than one thing at once. You were a good man who made bad choices. I was an ambitious woman who saw an opportunity. Sienna was a genius who learned to make herself invisible. None of these things are mutually exclusive. She kissed his cheek, gentle and final. Fix it with her if you can. Not for the business deal, though that would be smart. Fix it. Because you owe her an apology that actually costs you something. Then she was gone, disappeared into the crowd, and out of his life with the same efficiency she'd appeared, leaving him at the bar with an empty Scotch glass and the ruins of his certainty. The gala began to thin around 11. Grayson waited, nursing drinks he barely tasted, watching Sienna move through conversations with the ease of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for years. She knew how to work a room, how to make each person feel heard without committing to anything, how to turn down proposals so gracefully that people thanked her for the rejection. Finally, near midnight, she collected her wrap and headed toward the exit. Grayson intercepted her in the corridor outside the ballroom, empty except for hotel staff clearing glasses and the ambient hum of a building settling into late-night quiet. Can we talk, really talk, not whatever performance that was in there? She studied him for a long moment, weighing something he couldn't see. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks from here. Opens at 5:30, should be empty for another hour. Meet me there. The November cold hit like a slap after the heated ballroom. Grayson pulled his coat tighter and followed her through streets that glistened with earlier rain puddles, reflecting neon and streetlights in abstract patterns. She walked like someone who'd never been afraid of cities at night, confident and purposeful heels clicking against pavement in a rhythm that matched his own footsteps half a beat behind. The coffee shop was called the Copper Kettle, one of those aggressively quirky places with mismatched furniture and local art on exposed brick walls. The owner was just unlocking the door, a woman in her 60s with paint-stained jeans and kind eyes that went wide when she recognized Sienna. Ms. Ashford, I didn't know you were back in the city. Just for tonight, Margaret. The usual if you don't mind, and whatever he wants. She gestured toward Grayson without looking at him, already moving toward a corner booth that looked like her booth worn into her shape by frequent occupation. He ordered coffee he didn't want, and joined her, sliding into the opposite seat while Margaret bustled behind the counter, the espresso machine hissing and groaning through its morning wake-up routine. You come here often enough to have a usual. I bought this place 3 years ago, right after we got married, actually. Margaret was about to lose it to a developer who wanted to turn it into luxury condos. I prefer having somewhere quiet to work when I'm in Manhattan. She accepted her coffee from Margaret with a smile that transformed her face into something younger and more vulnerable. Thank you. Anything for you, dear. You let me know if you need anything else. They sat in silence while Margaret returned to the counter, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to grant the illusion of privacy. Grayson wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, using the heat to ground himself in the present moment, rather than spiraling into the past 3 years of missed signals and willful blindness. I didn't know. About any of it. Meridian, the money, the algorithm Vivian bought. I swear to you I didn't know. I believe you. You're not a good enough actor to have hidden that shock at the gala, which is actually one of your better qualities, Grayson. You're a terrible liar. It made loving you easier knowing that at least your cruelty was honest. The word love hit him in the chest like a physical blow. You really did love me. This wasn't just long-game corporate strategy. I fell in love with you at that charity benefit in Boston. You were giving a speech about financial literacy programs, and you made a joke about how most wealthy people couldn't balance a checkbook to save their lives, completely unaware that you were insulting half the donors in the room. It was the first time I'd ever heard someone from your world admit weakness instead of pretending perfection. I thought maybe you'd be different. But I wasn't. You were for a while. The first 6 months were real. You listened when I talked, asked questions about my work at Tomorrow's Scholars, actually seemed interested in my thoughts rather than just waiting for your turn to speak. Then Vivian started her campaign to make me feel inadequate, and you stopped defending me, stopped seeing me, just started managing me like another obligation that needed to be optimized or eliminated. Margaret brought over a plate of croissants that smelled like butter and better decisions. Neither of them reached for one. Grayson forced himself to meet Sienna's eyes to see the damage reflected there. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For listening to my mother instead of trusting my instincts. For letting Cordelia treat you like you were beneath her. For Alessandra. For asking for a divorce without ever trying to understand why our marriage felt empty. It felt empty because you stopped filling it with anything real. You treated me like set dressing for the life you thought you were supposed to have, and when I didn't perform the way Vivian expected, you decided I was defective, rather than questioning whether her expectations were." She took a sip of her coffee, the cup hiding her expression for a moment. "But I appreciate the apology. It doesn't change anything, but at least you're taking responsibility. What happens now? With Blackwell Capital, with the partnership, with the SEC investigation, Vivian is probably having a breakdown about. Now I decide whether destroying you is worth more than the partnership you're offering. Meridian could use Blackwell's distribution network, your client list, your reputation in traditional finance. But I could also go to the SEC with proof that your mother built a significant portion of your recent success on stolen intellectual property. Both options have their appeal." Grayson felt ice water in his veins. "You'd really do it? Burn down the whole company because of what happened between us?" "Don't flatter yourself. If I burn down Blackwell Capital, it won't be because you broke my heart. It'll be because your mother stole my code and profited from it for 3 years without compensation or credit. The personal and professional are separate. That's something you never understood." She was right, and the accuracy of it made him feel small and stupid. He'd thought everything was connected, that business and family and love all existed in the same ecosystem where each affected the others. But Sienna operated in multiple dimensions, simultaneously keeping each sphere distinct while managing their intersections with surgical precision. "What would it take to fix this? Not us. I understand that's broken. But the business relationship. What do you need from Blackwell Capital to make a partnership worth your while?" "Honesty for a start. I need to know exactly how much of your proprietary trading algorithm relies on code stolen from Meridian. I need full disclosure of your IPO financials, not the sanitized version you're presenting to underwriters, and I need a public apology from Vivian acknowledging the theft and crediting Meridian for the technology that generated 40% of your returns over the last 3 years. My mother will never agree to that. The publicity alone would crater the IPO. Then I guess we don't have a partnership." She started to stand, and Grayson felt panic rising in his throat. "Wait. Let me talk to her. Let me try to make her understand what's at stake here. Just give me 48 hours before you make any decisions." Sienna settled back into her seat, studying him with those dark eyes that had always seen more than he'd wanted to show. "You really think you can convince Vivian Blackwell to admit public wrongdoing, the woman who'd rather burn the company to ash than acknowledge a mistake?" "I think I can convince her that admitting one mistake is better than having all of them exposed. You said you had proof. How much proof?" "Emails, financial transactions, testimony from the engineer who sold the code. Enough to make the SEC investigation expand from routine inquiry into criminal prosecution. Enough to put Vivian in prison for wire fraud and you in professional exile for negligence." The casual delivery of that information, the way she laid out his complete destruction like items on a menu, made Grayson realize how thoroughly she'd been preparing for this moment. This wasn't improvisation. This was a strategy years in the making, every contingency planned, every possible response already war-gamed in her head. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the night you told me you wanted a divorce. I activated the final phase that evening. Sent the text to Thaddeus about going public with Meridian, started consolidating the evidence I'd been gathering about Vivian's acquisition of the code, began positioning Monroe Ventures as a potential alternative partner to put pressure on your decision-making. The gala was always going to be the reveal. You accelerated the timeline by refusing to see me as anything more than an inconvenience." Margaret refilled their coffee without asking, the gesture so familiar it barely registered. Grayson watched the steam rise from his cup, trying to find words adequate to the scope of what he'd destroyed. I loved you too. At the beginning. I know that doesn't matter now, but I want you to know it was real. What I felt wasn't strategy or obligation. You made me feel like I could be someone other than Vivian's son or the heir to Blackwell Capital. You made me think Gentle was valuable. And then I became an obstacle to what you really wanted, which was your mother's approval and a wife who looked good in photographs at fundraisers. Her voice was soft but final. Love isn't enough, Grayson. Love without respect is just dressed-up contempt. You loved the version of me you imagined, the quiet, charitable girl who'd be grateful for the privilege of your name. You never loved the woman who built Meridian because you never bothered to discover she existed. The truth of it settled over him like a burial shroud. She was right. He'd loved an idea, a fantasy of uncomplicated devotion that would smooth the sharp edges of his ambition without challenging it. The real Sienna, the one sitting across from him now, would have terrified him 3 years ago. Probably still did. For what it's worth, I'm proud of what you built. Meridian is extraordinary. The keynote was brilliant, and I'm sorry I was too stupid to see it when it mattered. She smiled, genuine warmth breaking through the ice for just a moment. That's the best thing you've said to me in 3 years. Thank you. Dawn was breaking outside, pink light starting to paint the sky in shades of hope and new chances. Margaret flipped the sign to open, and early morning people began trickling in, construction workers and night shift nurses and insomniacs seeking caffeine and human contact. Sienna checked her phone, then stood gathering her wrap. I have a flight to Boston in 3 hours. Conference call with the board about potential partnerships. You have 48 hours, Grayson. Get me full disclosure from Vivian, or I go to the SEC with everything. Your choice. She walked away, and this time Grayson didn't follow. Just sat there in the coffee shop she owned, drinking coffee that tasted like regret, and tried to figure out how to convince his mother to commit professional suicide to save them both. The confrontation with Vivian happened in her study at the estate windows overlooking gardens that had been manicured into submission by 3 generations of landscapers who knew better than to let nature get unruly on Blackwell property. She sat behind the desk that had belonged to her father, surrounded by photographs of family members who'd all made fortunes and few friends living monuments to the cost of dynasty. She wants a public apology. Full disclosure of how much of our proprietary trading success relies on her stolen code. Credit given to Meridian in all future financial reports. Vivian's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. Absolutely not. We'd be admitting criminal liability. The SEC would expand their investigation. Shareholders would revolt. The IPO would collapse. We'd lose everything. Or we do it and maybe salvage a partnership that's worth more than our pride. Meridian could transform Blackwell Capital Mother. The technology alone would put us decades ahead of competition. And what makes you think she'd actually partner with us after we publicly admit to stealing from her? You think she's going to reward honesty with opportunity? Grayson sat down across from her, exhaustion making his bones ache. I think she's giving us a choice between dignified surrender and total destruction. I think she's been 3 moves ahead of us for years, and this is her offering us a way to survive instead of annihilating us completely. Or it's a trap. She gets the apology, tanks our reputation, then partners with someone else anyway. We're left with nothing but documented guilt and no upside. That's possible. But what's certain is that if we don't cooperate, she goes to the SEC tomorrow with enough evidence to put you in prison. Is your pride worth that? Vivian turned to look out the window, her profile sharp against the morning light. For the first time in his life, Grayson saw her look old, the weight of years and mistakes making her seem suddenly mortal. I built this company from the scraps my father left me. Spent 40 years turning Blackwell Capital into something that mattered. And now my own son's ex-wife is going to destroy it because I bought code I had every legal right to purchase from a willing seller. You knew it was stolen. That engineer didn't have authority to sell Meridian's proprietary technology. I knew it was questionable. I chose not to ask questions that would have inconvenient answers. That's not the same as knowing. Mother, please, let me call Sienna, see if we can negotiate terms that protect you while giving her what she needs. There has to be a middle ground. She didn't answer immediately. The clock on the mantel ticked through 30 seconds that felt like hours. Finally, she turned back to him, and her eyes were cold and clear and absolutely ruthless. Call her. But understand this, Grayson. If we're going to sacrifice Blackwell's reputation to save it, then you're going to be the one who takes the fall. Public apology comes from you, not me. You were in charge of due diligence on all technology acquisitions. You failed to verify the source. This is your mistake, your public admission, your career suicide. The air left his lungs. I wasn't even here when you bought that code. I was still at Columbia getting my MBA. Then you failed to investigate it when you took over operations. Either way, you're the face of this apology. I remain in the background quietly restructuring the board to minimize my exposure. You protect me, or I let Sienna burn us both and take my chances with the courts. Grayson stared at his mother, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in his life. Not the matriarch, not the brilliant strategist, just a frightened woman so obsessed with self-preservation that she'd sacrifice her own son to maintain the illusion of control. If I do this, you step down as chairman. You retire to an advisory role with no voting power. You don't get to destroy my career and keep yours intact. Vivian's smile was thin and sharp as a paper cut. Acceptable. Draft the statement. Have your wife review it. Make sure it satisfies her requirements. We'll release it Friday morning before markets open. That gives us 2 days to position it as proactive transparency rather than forced admission. She's not my wife anymore. She'll always be your wife in the ways that matter. You don't stop loving someone just because the paperwork says you're divorced. You're still in love with her, Grayson. It's written all over your face. This whole doomed attempt to salvage a business relationship is really just you trying to prove to her that you're capable of doing the right thing when it costs you something. The accuracy of it made his chest hurt. He stood suddenly desperate to be out of this room, away from his mother's calculating gaze and the photographs of dead Blackwells who'd all chosen fortune over happiness. I'll draft the statement tonight, but understand that after this, I'm done being your shield. You protect yourself or you drown. I'm not sacrificing anything else for the Blackwell name. He left before she could respond, walked out of the estate, and kept walking until the manicured gardens gave way to wild woods at the property edge, trees that hadn't been told how to grow branches, reaching in directions no landscape architect had approved. The statement took 6 hours to write. Every word had to be precise, admitting enough to satisfy Sienna's requirements while minimizing legal exposure, accepting responsibility without providing ammunition for shareholders to sue. Thaddeus reviewed it remotely, made 3 changes, then forwarded it to Sienna with a note Grayson couldn't read. Her response came at 2 in the morning. Acceptable. Release it Friday. We'll discuss partnership terms next week. And Grayson, I'm sorry it had to be this way. He stared at those last words until his vision blurred. Sorry it had to be this way. Not sorry it happened. Just sorry about the method, about the collateral damage, about the fact that love had become leverage and marriage had become a masterclass in strategic destruction. Friday morning, the statement went live across business wire services before the opening bell. Grayson Blackwell, Vive P of Blackwell Capital. Accepting full responsibility for failing to verify the provenance of proprietary trading technology, acknowledging that significant portions of the algorithm had been developed by Meridian Technologies, promising full cooperation with ongoing SEC investigations and immediate licensing agreements to compensate for unauthorized use. The markets reacted predictably. Blackwell Capital's stock dropped 18% before trading was halted. Vivian's phone rang constantly, board members demanding explanations, shareholders threatening lawsuits, underwriters pulling out of the IPO. Cordelia called crying, asking if this meant she'd have to get an actual job, and Grayson hung up on her halfway through the question. But Meridian's stock, which had been quietly trading on private exchanges for years, spiked 40%. Sienna's public response, released an hour after his statement, was masterful in its restraint. She acknowledged Blackwell's cooperation, expressed hope for future partnership, and pivoted immediately to discussing Meridian's expansion into new security sectors, making it clear that she'd already moved past this drama into bigger ambitions. The media coverage ran for 3 days. Financial press called it everything from unprecedented transparency to career suicide. Tech journalists praised Sienna for protecting her intellectual property while leaving room for reconciliation. Someone dug up photos from their wedding, ran them next to pictures of Sienna at the gala, and wrote, "Think pieces about power dynamics in marriage and why successful women hide their achievements." Grayson watched it all from his apartment in the city, the one he'd moved into after the divorce, drinking coffee and reading articles that dissected his failures with clinical precision. His phone accumulated messages he didn't answer. Friends offering support that sounded like obituary planning. Business contacts distancing themselves from someone now radioactive in corporate circles. Alessandra sent a single text, "You did the right thing. It doesn't feel like it now, but you did." On Monday, Sienna's assistant called with meeting coordinates. Tuesday afternoon, Meridian headquarters in Boston, conference room B. Come alone. Bring your best proposal for partnership structure. The Meridian building was everything the Blackwell estate wasn't. Modern glass and steel open floor plans, employees who looked engaged rather than endured. Security waved him through after checking his ID, and an assistant who couldn't have been older than 25 escorted him to the top floor, where executive offices overlooked Boston Harbor. Sienna was already in the conference room, surrounded by whiteboards covered in diagrams he couldn't parse, and 3 other people he recognized from tech industry publications. Her head of security, her chief technology officer, and Thaddeus Sterling, the lawyer who'd sent those first anonymous texts. She gestured to a chair. "Grayson Blackwell, meet the team. They've all read your proposal. We have questions." The next 3 hours were the most intellectually brutal of his life. They dissected Blackwell Capital's infrastructure, asking questions that revealed how little he actually understood about the technology underpinning modern finance. They challenged every assumption in his partnership proposal, exposing weaknesses and gaps he hadn't seen. They made him defend ideas he'd thought were solid until they turned out to be built on foundations of sand and wishful thinking. But they also listened. When he made good points, they acknowledged them. When he admitted ignorance, they explained rather than mocked. It felt less like negotiation and more like education, like they were teaching him to see the world from a different angle, where technology drove strategy rather than the reverse. Sienna watched mostly in silence, interjecting occasionally to redirect conversation or clarify his intent. She'd changed into casual clothes, jeans, and a sweater that probably cost more than his suit but looked comfortable in a way designer clothes rarely managed. She seemed more at ease here, surrounded by people who understood her language than she'd ever looked at Blackwell family dinners. Finally, around 6, the CTO stood and stretched. "I think we've tortured him enough for one day. Sienna, you want me to send over the revised terms? Please. And the security assessment we discussed. If we're doing this, I want to make sure Blackwell's infrastructure can handle integration without compromising our protocols." The team filed out, leaving Grayson and Sienna alone in the conference room with its view of darkening harbor water and city lights starting to puncture the twilight. "That was intense," she smiled. "That was them being gentle. You should see what happens when we're actually trying to destroy someone's credibility." "I believe it." He gathered his notes, realized half of them were now obsolete based on the conversation. "Are we actually doing this? The partnership? Pending board approval and security clearance? Yes. The terms will be different from what you proposed. More equitable, less weighted toward Blackwell retaining majority control. But yes, Meridian could use your distribution network, and you need our technology to rebuild credibility. It's mutually beneficial. And us. Is there an us, or is that dead and buried?" Sienna looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "There's a version of us that could exist, different from before, based on honesty instead of assumption. But I don't know if you're ready for that, Grayson. Being in relationship with me now means seeing all of me, the parts that built Meridian, and the parts that were hurt by your family. It means accepting that I'm smarter than you in some ways, more successful in others, and that partnership requires ego subordination you've never had to practice. I want to try. Not because of the business deal, because I finally see what I was too blind to recognize before. You're extraordinary, and I'm tired of being the person who couldn't appreciate extraordinary when it was sitting across from me at dinner. She stood, walked to the window, her reflection ghostly against the glass. You broke something when you chose them over me. When you let your mother call me worthless and didn't defend me. When you slept with Alessandra while I was at home pretending not to know. That doesn't heal just because you apologized. I know, but maybe it could heal over time if I proved I'd changed. If I showed up differently. Maybe. She turned back to him, and in the low light she looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with in Boston before money and family and pride had poisoned everything simple. Or maybe the best we can do is be good business partners and friendly exes. Not everyone gets a second chance at love, Grayson. Sometimes the ending is just the ending. He nodded throat-tight with things he couldn't say, truths he'd learned too late to matter. Then I'll settle for friendly exes and good business partners. And if someday that becomes something more, I'll know I earned it instead of expecting it as birthright. She walked him to the elevator, her hand resting briefly on his arm in a gesture that felt like forgiveness deferred, not granted. The partnership terms will be in your inbox tomorrow. Review them with Marcus. Make sure you understand what you're agreeing to. And Grayson, thank you for the apology. It cost you something real. That matters. The elevator doors closed and he descended through floors of innovation and ambition down to the ground level where his car waited to take him back to New York and the wreckage of everything he'd thought he wanted. But for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something close to peace. He'd lost his wife, nearly lost his company, destroyed his reputation and his relationship with his mother, but he'd found something more valuable in the wreckage, the beginning of self-respect, the possibility that doing right mattered more than winning, the knowledge that love without integrity was just another form of theft. The city lights blurred past the windows as the car merged onto the highway, carrying him away from Siena and toward whatever came next. He didn't know if they'd rebuild what they'd broken, didn't know if Blackwell Capital would survive the scandal or the partnership. But he knew he'd finally seen her, really seen her. And that was worth all the rest. The partnership terms arrived at 7 the next morning, a 100-page document that made clear exactly how thoroughly Siena had reimagined what collaboration meant. Meridian would license its security technology to Blackwell Capital for integration into their financial services platform, but the control mechanisms were weighted so heavily toward Meridian that Grayson spent the first hour just mapping out the decision tree to understand who actually held power at each junction. Marcus called before he'd finished the second section. Have you seen Clause 47, the one where Meridian retains veto authority over any client onboarding that might compromise their security protocols? That's essentially letting them control our entire customer acquisition strategy. I saw it. Along with the quarterly audits, the technology review boards, and the provision that lets them terminate the partnership with 30 days' notice if we fail any compliance check. This isn't a partnership, it's supervised probation. Grayson stared out his apartment window at Manhattan waking up below. We don't have leverage here, Marcus. We're the ones who got caught stealing their technology. They're being generous by even considering partnership instead of prosecution. Vivian is going to lose her mind when she sees these terms. Vivian doesn't get a vote anymore. The board removed her from operational decisions yesterday. She's advisory only until the SEC investigation concludes. The silence carried weight. Marcus had worked for Vivian longer than he'd worked for Grayson, built his career under her mentorship. What do you need from me? Review the liability sections. Make sure we're not exposing ourselves to future lawsuits. Then get it to the board for emergency vote. We need approval by Friday or Meridian walks. 3 days to convince a board of directors to accept terms that amounted to surrendering autonomy in exchange for survival. Grayson spent Wednesday building the case, creating presentations that showed projected revenue with and without Meridian's technology modeling scenarios, where Blackwell Capital tried to go it alone against competitors who'd inevitably fill the gap. The numbers were brutal in their clarity. Without Meridian, Blackwell Capital would limp along for maybe 18 months before being acquired or dissolved. With Meridian, even under their restrictive terms, the company could rebuild credibility and potentially return to growth within 3 years. Vivian called that evening, her voice carrying the cold fury of someone who'd been forced to watch their legacy get dismantled by committee. You're giving them everything: control, oversight, veto authority. We become a company that survives long enough to matter again. That's more than we deserve given what you did. What I did saved this company from mediocrity. Grayson felt exhaustion settle into his bones. And now we're a national cautionary tale about intellectual property theft. Was it worth it, Mother? The money you made versus the reputation you destroyed? She didn't answer immediately. When she spoke again, her voice had aged a decade. I thought I was protecting you, building something substantial you could inherit without having to fight for every inch. Ethics don't build dynasties, you always said, but they do build something more valuable: self-respect. The mention of his father, dead from a heart attack 15 years ago, hung unspoken between them. The man who'd been good, who'd been ethical, and who'd died exhausted from trying to meet impossible standards while maintaining his own integrity. Dad would be ashamed of what you became. The line went dead. Grayson sat in the silence, knowing he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, severed something between himself and his mother that had been fraying for years. The board met Thursday afternoon in emergency session. 9 directors crammed into a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and desperation. Grayson presented the Meridian terms, walked them through the projections, answered questions that ranged from technical to existential. Cordelia surprisingly spoke first. She'd been quieter since the gala, some of her usual bravado worn away. I think we should accept. We made a mistake, a huge one. These terms are the price of fixing it. The vote was 6-3 in favor, not unanimous, but enough. Marcus would send the executed agreement to Meridian by end of day. Grayson called Sienna from the parking garage. The board approved. Marcus is sending over the executed documents within the hour. Good. Integration planning starts Monday. You'll need to clear your calendar for the first week. We'll be on site at Blackwell Capital assessing infrastructure and identifying vulnerabilities. You're coming personally. I lead all major integrations for the first phase. Try not to make it weird. The hint of humor in her voice made his chest tighten. I'll do my best. Sienna, thank you. For the partnership. For not destroying us when you easily could have. Destroying you wouldn't have served any purpose except revenge. And revenge is expensive. It costs the parts of yourself you have to kill to become cruel enough to enjoy other people's suffering. I didn't want to pay that price. The call ended, leaving Grayson with the weight of unearned mercy. Integration week began with infrastructure upgrades that required shutting down major systems for hours at a time. Clients complained about service interruptions. Employees grumbled about new security protocols. Grayson spent the week managing resistance and explaining why short-term pain would create long-term stability. Sienna was everywhere in meetings and server rooms and strategy sessions, moving through Blackwell Capital like she owned it, which in every way that mattered she did. She was patient with people who were trying, ruthless with those who resisted change out of pride rather than principle. They fell into a rhythm of professional collaboration that felt almost like friendship in its efficiency. She'd identify a problem, he'd find the internal resources to address it. He'd encounter resistance, she'd provide the external authority to override it. Wednesday afternoon, she found him in his office reviewing employee performance metrics. I'm flying to Boston tonight. Board meeting tomorrow about the Monroe acquisition finalization. I'll be back Friday to oversee the client data migration. Okay. He didn't look up from the spreadsheet, trying to maintain casual professionalism. Grayson? Something in her voice made him meet her eyes. She looked tired, the week's intensity showing in fine lines around her mouth. We need to talk. Really talk, not just partnership logistics and audit findings. This thing between us, the history and the hurt and the fact that we're now professionally entangled, we can't keep pretending it doesn't exist. His heart kicked against his ribs. "What did you have in mind?" "Dinner. Saturday. Neutral territory, no business agenda. Just two people who used to be married trying to figure out if they can be friends now that the paperwork says they're strangers." "That sounds terrifying." "It should. Everything worth doing is terrifying at the start." She smiled, genuine warmth breaking through the professional mask. "There's a restaurant in Brooklyn I like. Small, quiet. Meet me there at 7. She handed him an address on a slip of paper and walked away, leaving him holding coordinates to a conversation he'd been avoiding for months. By Friday afternoon, Phase 2 was complete. Blackwell Capital's infrastructure had been rebuilt to current security standards. The chief technology officer from Meridian Drive, Sarah Chen, presented the final audit results. "You were worse than we projected. We found evidence of 3 separate data breaches in the last 18 months that your monitoring systems failed to detect." Marcus went pale. "Breaches? What kind of data was accessed?" "Client financial information mostly. The good news is we don't think the data was exfiltrated. The breaches appear exploratory rather than theft-focused. And the bad news? You didn't notice for 18 months. Which means any regulatory audits would have found the same vulnerabilities and shut you down for gross negligence." Dr. Chen pulled up another slide. "We've patched the holes, implemented new monitoring systems, but you need to file disclosure reports with the SEC within 30 days. The room erupted. Grayson let them talk for 2 minutes, then brought the meeting back to order. "We disclose everything. Full transparency with the SEC with clients. No hiding, no minimizing." He looked at Sienna, who was watching from the back with an expression he couldn't read. "Thank you to Meridian's team for finding these issues and fixing them before they became catastrophic." Dr. Chen nodded. "We'll provide supporting documentation for your SEC filings. This isn't Blackwell's fault, not directly. Most mid-size financial firms have similar vulnerabilities." Saturday arrived with December cold that made the city feel clean. Grayson spent the afternoon in nervous preparation, arriving at the restaurant 20 minutes early. The place was called Ember, one of those neighborhood spots sustained by regulars who valued consistency over novelty. Exposed brick, mismatched tables, a bar that looked like it had absorbed 1,000 confessions. Sienna arrived exactly at 7, punctual in the way of people who respected other people's time. She'd dressed-down jeans and a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger this way, closer to the woman he'd met in Boston 4 years ago. They ordered wine and pretended to study menus they weren't reading. Finally, she set down her menu. "I want to know why you married me. The real reason, not the story you told yourself or the one you told Vivian." The question was fair, deserved, terrifying. "Because you made me feel like I could be someone other than what I was supposed to be. With you, I wasn't Vivian's son or the Blackwell heir. I was just myself, whoever that was underneath all the conditioning. And you seemed to like that person, which made me hope he might actually exist." Past tense. "Did that person die when we got married?" "No. I killed him slowly by choosing comfort over courage. Every time I stayed silent instead of defending you, every time I prioritized my mother's approval over your dignity, I was killing the version of myself that had been brave enough to love you." The waiter appeared with wine, giving them a moment to retreat. When he left, Sienna continued, "I'm not asking for apologies anymore. What I want to know is whether the person you killed is still dead or if you've been rebuilding him. I think he's in recovery, learning to make decisions based on what's right instead of what's easy. Still scared most of the time, still failing more than succeeding, but at least trying. Good, because the only version of you I could ever be friends with is the one who's willing to be uncomfortable. Comfort is poison for people like us." Their food arrived. They talked about easier things, the integration progress, mutual acquaintances, a documentary about artificial intelligence that Sienna had consulted on. The conversation flowed with surprising ease. Dessert came and went. The restaurant began to empty around them. They ordered more wine and kept talking, hours passing without notice. "Can I ask about Alessandra?" Sienna's voice was careful. "What about her?" whether you're still in love with her, whether that relationship was real or just exit strategy. Grayson considered honestly. I don't think I was ever in love with her. I was in love with the idea of her with being wanted by someone who seemed to have their life figured out. But it was shallow. We were using each other, both knew it, and told ourselves that mutual exploitation was the same as partnership. Do you think she's happy now, selling to Meridian? I think she's relieved. Running a company is exhausting when you're doing it to prove something rather than because you love the work. Sienna nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for further words. The restaurant closed around them. They stepped out into December night, cold enough to see breath. They walked without destination, side by side, hands in pockets, the silence comfortable for the first time since before the marriage had started dying. I've been thinking about selling the Blackwell estate. Grayson's voice was quiet. Too many ghosts there, too much accumulated weight of expectation and disappointment. What would Vivian say? She'd say I'm betraying family legacy, but the estate was never really home. Just a museum we lived in, preserving the past instead of building the future. They reached a small park empty except for a few people walking dogs. Sienna sat on a bench, and Grayson joined her. I'm building something. Her voice had gone quiet, almost hesitant. Beyond Meridian, beyond Monroe Ventures, a network of integrated technology companies that can work together to solve problems no single entity could handle alone. AI, security, automation, data analytics, all pieces of a larger ecosystem. How many companies? 4 acquired so far, 3 more in negotiation. Eventually, maybe 20 or 30 each specializing in something different, but all sharing resources and information. A cooperative instead of a conglomerate. Grayson felt understanding dawn. You're building what capitalism usually prevents. Companies working together instead of competing. I'm trying. It might fail spectacularly, but I have to try because the alternative, every company fighting every other company for market share while the world burns, that future is guaranteed failure. Where does Blackwell Capital fit? Financial infrastructure for the network. Capital allocation, payment processing, investment management for the cooperative. You'd be the banking arm handling money while other companies handle technology. The scope of it made him dizzy. Not just a partnership, but integration into something vast and experimental, a bet on collaboration over competition. When were you planning to tell me this? Tonight. I wanted to see if you were ready to think bigger than Blackwell Capital's survival. I needed to know if you could imagine being part of something that might fail, but would fail trying to make the world different rather than just succeeding at making it the same. Grayson looked at her profile against the streetlight, this woman who'd hidden genius under gentleness, who'd built empires while everyone assumed she was building nothing. I want to be part of it, whatever you're building. Not because it makes business sense or because it'll save Blackwell Capital, but because you're the only person I know who's brave enough to try impossible things and smart enough to maybe succeed. She turned to face him, and in the amber light her eyes shone with something that might have been tears. It's not going to fix us. Being part of the network doesn't undo the divorce or erase what happened. We're still going to be 2 people who loved each other and failed at it. I know, but maybe we can be 2 people who failed at marriage and succeeded at building something that matters more than our individual happiness. Maybe that's enough. Maybe. She stood, pulling her coat tighter. I need to go. Early flight tomorrow. He walked her to the corner where she'd catch a cab. They stood there in the cold breath mixing in the air between them. Thank you for dinner, for honest conversation, for giving me another chance to see you clearly instead of through the fog of my own assumptions. She reached up, touched his face briefly, the gesture both intimate and final. You're becoming someone I could respect. Keep going in that direction. The person waiting at the end might be worth knowing. A cab pulled up. She got in, and he watched the taillights disappear, carrying her away toward airports and meetings and the future she was building with or without him. He walked home through December streets, past storefronts decorated for holidays, past couples holding hands, and families laughing past all the ordinary happiness that had seemed so elusive when he'd been chasing it directly. And he felt for the first time in years like he was exactly where he needed to be. Not happy, not successful, not any of the things he'd been taught to value. Just honest. Just trying. Just beginning to understand that the best endings aren't about winning or losing, but about becoming someone worthy of the second chances life occasionally offers. The cold air sharp in his lungs, he understood finally what Sienna had been trying to teach him all along. That value wasn't something you inherited or demanded. It was something you demonstrated through the choices you made when no one was watching, when the cost was real and the reward uncertain. Blackwell Capital would integrate fully into Meridian's cooperative network over the next 6 months. Vivian would take her SEC deal and retire to coastal Maine, last seen tending roses in a garden small enough to manage alone. Cordelia would surprise everyone by enrolling in business school, determined to earn what she'd always assumed was birthright. And the network would grow company by company, proving that another way was possible, even when it was harder and riskier and required trusting people who'd been trained since birth to compete. But that December night, walking home through streets that glittered with ice and possibility, Grayson didn't know any of that yet. He only knew he'd finally seen her clearly, had finally become someone capable of seeing her at all. And that was enough. That was everything.